The early morning light filtered through the cracked facades of the city's forgotten streets. The air hung heavy with the scent of decay and desperation, a world that most people ignored, where life moved in shadows. Among the litter-strewn alleyways and rusted dumpsters, a man moved with an almost ghostly presence, unnoticed by most, but not by all. His clothes, worn and patched, hung loosely on a frame that spoke of hard years and harder nights. Despite the grime and wear, his posture carried a quiet dignity, his movements deliberate. The veteran, a man with a past written in scars and unspoken memories, navigated the streets like a soldier on patrol. Each step was careful, his eyes scanning the surroundings with a precision that belied his disheveled appearance. 2 blocks away, a group of young men lounged against a graffiti-covered wall, their laughter sharp and grating against the stillness of the morning. They wore the colors of a local cartel, their swagger filled with the confidence of those who knew they owned these streets. One of them, a wiry figure with a cocky grin and a switchblade flicking between his fingers, spotted the veteran. "Hey, check this out," the thug said, nodding toward the man shuffling past. "Looks like we got ourselves a new recruit." The others turned, their gazes locking onto the veteran. To them, he was nothing more than another broken man, a piece of the city's forgotten detritus. But the veteran felt their eyes on him before they even spoke. His pace didn't falter, his gaze remaining forward, but his mind shifted gears. Years of training kicked in, assessing threats, cataloging exits, and weighing the odds. The wiry thug pushed off the wall, swaggering toward him. "Hey, old man," he called out, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "Where you headed so early? Got a hot date with a dumpster?" The veteran didn't respond. He'd learned long ago that words often did more harm than good in situations like this. Instead, he adjusted his grip on the worn backpack, slung over his shoulder, his fingers brushing against the frayed strap as he continued walking. "Hey, I'm talking to you," the thug shouted, his voice rising. He closed the distance quickly, cutting in front of the veteran and forcing him to stop. The others sauntered closer, forming a loose semicircle around them. The veteran's eyes flicked to each of them in turn, noting their stances, their hands, their weapon. A flash of metal in a waistband here, the bulge of a concealed knife there. They were sloppy, overconfident, but numbers had a way of evening the odds. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. "What's the matter?" the thug sneered, stepping closer. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just too good to talk to us." Another thug, a stocky man with a shaved head, chuckled. "He's probably deaf, old and deaf. Ain't that right, Gramps?" The veteran's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't respond. He shifted his weight slightly, angling his body toward the alley to his left. A subtle move, but one that positioned him for a quicker escape if things turned ugly. The wiry thug's grin widened. "Oh, I see how it is. You think you're too good for us, huh?" He reached out and shoved the veteran's shoulder. It wasn't a hard shove, but it was enough to make a statement. The others laughed, the sound echoing off the brick walls. For a brief moment, the veteran's gaze met the thug. In that instant, something flickered in his eyes, a flash of steel, cold and unyielding. The thug hesitated, caught off guard by the intensity of that look. But the moment passed, and the veteran stepped back, breaking eye contact and turning to leave. "Hey, I'm not done with you," the thug barked, his voice tinged with irritation. He grabbed the veteran's arm, yanking him back. "You don't walk away from me, old man." The veteran's body tensed, his mind raced, calculating options. The grip on his arm was firm but not unbreakable. The others were close, but their stances were relaxed, unprepared. He could take down the thug holding him in less than 3 seconds, maybe 4 if he wanted to avoid causing permanent damage. But what then? The others would jump in, and the situation would spiral out of control. "Let go," he said quietly, his voice low and even. The thug laughed. "What's that? Speak up, Grandpa." "Didn't catch that," I said. "Let go." The calm authority in his tone gave the thug pause. For a split second, doubt crossed his face. But his ego wouldn't let him back down. He tightened his grip, yanking the veteran closer. "Or what?" he challenged, his face inches from the veteran's. "What are you going to do, huh?" The veteran's response was swift and precise. His free hand shot up, grabbing the thug's wrist and twisting it sharply. The thug cried out as the knife clattered to the ground. In the same motion, the veteran stepped forward, using his shoulder to drive the thug off balance and sending him sprawling onto the pavement. The laughter stopped. The remaining thugs stared in stunned silence as their friend scrambled to his feet, clutching his wrist and glaring at the veteran. "You're gonna pay for that," the thug growled, his voice shaking with anger. He looked to the others. "What are you waiting for? Get him!" The group hesitated, but the veteran's calm demeanor only seemed to enrage them further. They moved in, circling him like predators closing in on wounded prey. The veteran's stance shifted, his weight balanced, his hands loose at his side. He'd been here before, countless times. The faces were different, but the situation was the same, and he knew how it would end. The first thug lunged, a wild swing aimed at the veteran's head. He ducked easily, stepping to the side, and using the momentum to drive an elbow into the man's ribs. A sharp gasp escaped the thug as he stumbled back, clutching his side. Another thug rushed in, this one swinging a length of chain. The veteran caught the chain mid-swing, yanking it free and using it to trip the attacker. The thug hit the ground hard, the chain rattling against the pavement. The remaining thugs hesitated, their confidence faltering. The veteran didn't wait for them to recover. He moved with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime honing his craft, disarming and incapacitating each of them with calculated efficiency. Within moments, the alley was littered with groaning, writhing bodies, the wiry thug now backing away, stared at the veteran with wide eyes. "What the hell are you?" he stammered. The veteran picked up his backpack, slinging it over his shoulder. He looked down at the thug, his expression unreadable. "Someone you shouldn't have messed with," he said quietly. He turned and walked away, leaving the thugs to nurse their wounds and their wounded pride. As he disappeared into the shadows, the wiry thug scrambled to his feet, pulling out his phone with shaking hands. "Boss," he said, his voice trembling, We got a problem." The sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows down the narrow alleyways as the veteran continued his walk, blending back into the city's underbelly. Every step felt heavier than the last, his mind replaying the altercation from moments ago. He didn't seek violence, but it always had a way of finding him. He kept his head low, scanning his surroundings with the wariness of someone who'd lived through too many ambushes. The cartel thugs were not the first to underestimate him, and they wouldn't be the last. But he knew this wasn't over. People, like them, didn't take humiliation lightly, and their retaliation would come. It was only a matter of time. For now, he needed to disappear, to fade into the urban sprawl where faces and names became nothing more than fleeting whispers. Somewhere across the city, in a dimly lit room above a seedy bar, a cartel lieutenant slammed his fist on a scarred wooden table. The wiry thug, his nose bloodied and pride shattered, stood before him, trembling under the lieutenant's glare. "You're telling me a homeless guy did this?" The lieutenant growled, his voice low and dangerous. "4 of you, and you couldn't handle one old man?" The thug stammered, trying to find the words to justify their failure. "Boss, he wasn't just some old man. The way he moved, the way he fought. It was like he knew what we were going to do before we did it. He's not normal." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. "Not normal?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You think I care about excuses? He made you look like fools. Now everyone's going to think we're weak. You know what that means?" The thug swallowed hard, his silence answering the question. Weakness in their world invited challenges, and challenges led to bloodshed. The lieutenant straightened, pulling out his phone and dialing a number. "Find him," he barked into the receiver. "I don't care how. Just make sure he knows what happens when you mess with us." Back on the streets, the veteran ducked into a small diner, the kind that hadn't changed in decades. The scent of stale coffee and frying bacon greeted him as he stepped inside. A tired-looking waitress glanced up from behind the counter, her eyes lingering on him for a moment before returning to the newspapers she was skimming. He slid into a booth at the far corner, the vinyl seat creaking under his weight. From his backpack, he pulled out a battered notebook and a pencil stub, flipping to a page filled with scrawled names and numbers. It was a ritual he'd maintained for years, a way to keep track of the faces and places that haunted his past. As he ran his fingers over the names, a sense of purpose began to settle over him. This city was just another battlefield, and he needed to prepare. The waitress approached, setting down a chipped mug and a steaming pot of coffee. "What'll it be?" she asked, her tone devoid of the usual small-town friendliness. "Just coffee," he replied, his voice quiet but firm. She nodded, pouring the dark liquid before walking away without another word. The veteran wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into his fingers. He'd barely taken a sip when the diner's door jingled open and 2 men stepped inside. They weren't locals. Their clean-cut appearance and sharp eyes marked them as outsiders. They scanned the room briefly before one of them, a broad-shouldered man with a predatory air, locked eyes with the veteran. He nudged his companion, and the two made their way over to the booth. The veteran didn't look up as they approached, but his body tensed, every nerve on high alert. The broad-shouldered man slid into the seat across from him, while the other leaned against the booth's edge. "Morning," the man said, his tone falsely cheerful. "Mind if we join you?" The veteran's gaze remained fixed on his coffee. "I'm not looking for trouble," the man chuckled. "Neither are we. Just here to have a friendly chat." His companion snorted. "Friendly? That's one way to put it." The veteran finally looked up, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Say what you came to say." The broad-shouldered man leaned forward, his smile fading. "You had a run-in with some of our guys earlier. Made quite an impression from what I hear. My boss doesn't like impressions. He likes things quiet, orderly. You understand?" "Thayas." Veteran's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Here's the deal," the man continued. "You pack up and leave town. Today. We'll even give you a little something for the road." He slid an envelope across the table. "Or you can stick around and see what happens when you don't play nice." The veteran glanced at the envelope, but didn't touch it. "And if I don't?" The man's smile returned, colder this time. "Let's just say it won't be pretty. For you or anyone who gets in our way." A tense silence hung between them. Finally, the veteran pushed the envelope back across the table. "Tell your boss I'm not interested." The man's smile vanished completely. He stood, motioning to his companion. "Suit yourself. But don't say we didn't warn you." As they walked away, the veteran watched them through the diner's grease-streaked window, his reflection superimposed over their retreating figures. He knew their type all too well, and he knew this was just the beginning, but he wasn't running. Not this time. The cartel's retaliation began sooner than the veteran anticipated. As the sun dipped below the city skyline, the streets took on an ominous stillness, the kind that made the air feel heavier, the shadows darker. He kept moving, sticking to back alleys and deserted paths, but the quiet only amplified his unease. He knew they would come, and when they did, they wouldn't. Hold back! Near an abandoned warehouse, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. Not one pair, but several, moving with purpose. He stopped, his ears straining to discern their direction. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they surrounded him, echoing off the crumbling walls of the alley. Slowly he turned, his sharp eyes taking in the figures emerging from the darkness. 5 men, all armed. The wiry thug from earlier stood among them, his cocky grin replaced with a scowl of determination. Beside him was the broad-shouldered man from the diner, his stance exuding confidence, and behind them 3 more cartel enforcers, each holding weapons ranging from crowbars to handguns. They blocked the alley's exit, hemming him in like a predator cornering its prey. The broad-shouldered man stepped forward, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "Didn't think you'd be so easy to find. Guess you're not as slippery as you think." The veteran's expression remained neutral, his body relaxed but ready. "You should have left it alone." The man's smile widened. "Oh, I don't think so. You made a mess, old man, and now we're here to clean it up." One of the enforcers cocked his gun, the metallic click cutting through the tension like a knife. The veteran's eyes flicked to the weapon, then back to the leader, his mind calculating distances and angles. He'd been in worse situations before, but this one would require precision and speed. "Last chance," the broad-shouldered man said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Get on your knees, beg for mercy, and maybe we'll let you crawl out of here in one piece." The veteran didn't respond. Instead, he dropped his backpack to the ground and stepped forward, his movements deliberate and calm. His silence only seemed to irritate the thug. "What, you got a death wish?" The wiry thug spat, gripping a crowbar tightly. "Do it! Get on your knees!" The veteran stopped, his eyes locking onto the wiry thug. "You don't know what you're doing," he said quietly. The wiry thug laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm about to teach you a lesson you won't forget." He lunged forward, the crowbar swinging in a wide arc. The veteran moved like a shadow, sidestepping the attack with ease. His hand shot out, grabbing the thug's wrist and twisting it with enough force to disarm him. The crowbar clattered to the ground as the thug cried out, clutching his injured arm. Before the others could react, the veteran struck. His movements were fluid and precise, a blur of calculated violence honed by years of training. He closed the distance to the nearest enforcer, redirecting the man's aim and delivering a crushing blow to his jaw. The gun fell from the enforcer's hand, and the veteran kicked it away, sending it skidding across the alley. The broad-shouldered man shouted orders, but the veteran was already on the next target. He used his surroundings to his advantage, ducking behind a stack of crates to avoid a wild swing from another thug. Grabbing a loose plank of wood, he deflected a knife attack and countered with a strike to the attacker's ribs, leaving him gasping for air. The remaining 2 enforcers hesitated, their confidence faltering as they watched their comrades fall one by one. The broad-shouldered man snarled, pulling out a handgun and taking aim. "Stay still, damn it!" he shouted. The veteran didn't comply. He moved quickly, weaving between the scattered debris and forcing the man to waste bullets on missed shots. One ricocheted off a metal pipe, the sharp clang echoing through the alley. In the chaos, the veteran closed the distance, grabbing the man's wrist and forcing the gun upward as it fired its last round into the air. With a swift twist, he disarmed the thug and sent him sprawling to the ground. Now, only the broad-shouldered man remained, his bravado replaced with visible panic. He scrambled backward, reaching for the discarded handgun, but the veteran's boot landed on it, pinning it to the ground. The 2 locked eyes, and for the first time, the man saw not a homeless drifter, but a soldier, calm, composed, and utterly lethal. "Who are you?" the man whispered, his voice trembling. The veteran didn't answer. He leaned down, picking up the handgun and ejecting the magazine before tossing the empty weapon aside. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving the man to sit amidst the wreckage of his crew. As he disappeared into the night, the veteran knew this wouldn't be the end. The cartel would come again, stronger and more determined. But he didn't fear them. He'd faced worse in the unforgiving deserts of war, and he'd survived. This was just another battle, another enemy, and he'd fight it the only way he knew how, with precision, strategy, and an unyielding resolve to endure. The night deepened, and the city seemed to hold its breath. The veteran found himself at the edge of an industrial park, its skeletal structures and rusted machinery silhouetted against the pale glow of distant streetlight. He moved cautiously, aware of the danger lurking in the shadows. The cartel wouldn't let this go, and he needed to be one step ahead. Inside one of the larger warehouses, a meeting was underway. The broad-shouldered man stood before a table, strewn with maps, weapons, and cash. Around him, a dozen cartel enforcers listened as he barked out orders, his earlier fear now replaced with a desperate need to regain control. "He's just one man," he growled, slamming a fist onto the table. "I don't care what he did to you. We're not going to let some washed-up soldier embarrass us." The wiry thug from before shifted uncomfortably, nursing his injured wrist. "Boss, he's not normal. The way he moves, it's like he's been doing this his whole life. We're gonna need more guys, better firepower." The broad-shouldered man shot him a withering glare. "We have the firepower. What we need is for you idiots to stop screwing up. I want him found tonight. Spread out. Check every alley, every abandoned building. He's not leaving this city." The men nodded and began to disperse, their movements purposeful and efficient. But as they prepared to leave, a sudden noise echoed through the warehouse, a metallic clang, faint but unmistakable. The broad-shouldered man froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp. The enforcers exchanged uneasy glances. "Probably just a rat," one of them muttered. "Then go check it out," the man snapped. 2 enforcers moved toward the source of the noise, flashlights cutting through the dim interior. The beams danced across rusted machinery and piles of debris, but the shadows seemed to shift and writhe, concealing more than they revealed. The veteran watched from above, perched silently on a steel beam that spanned the width of the warehouse. His breathing was slow and steady, his body still as he waited for the right moment. One of the enforcers stepped closer to a stack of crate, his flashlight flickering. "Nothing here," he called out, his voice tinged with relief. Before he could turn, the discharged under circumstances that were heavily redacted, a ghost living off the grid until now. "He's not just a soldier," Santiago murmured to himself. "He's a weapon." Meanwhile, the veteran descended from his rooftop perch, blending into the city's flow with practiced ease. He had no illusions about his situation. The cartel's resources were vast, their reach extensive. They would find him again, and they would come in greater numbers. But he wasn't planning to wait. For them, this time, he would take the fight to them. He made his way to a small storage unit on the outskirts of the city. The door creaked open to reveal a collection of gear, not much, but enough to remind him of the life he'd left behind. A tactical vest, a pair of reinforced boots, and a well-maintained rifle wrapped in a protective cloth. He suited up methodically, each piece a part of the armor he once wore without question. The veteran's mind raced as he pieced together a plan. The cartel had underestimated him, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. To survive, he needed to disrupt their operations, to hit them where it hurt. he thought of Santiago, the name whispered among the enforcers as the man who called the shots. If he could get to Santiago, he could force the cartel to back down or crumble entirely. Night fell again, and the city's underbelly came alive with activity. The veteran moved through the shadows, his every step calculated. He had spent the day mapping out the cartel's known locations, identifying weak points in their network. His first target was a drug distribution hub, disguised as a nightclub on the city's south side. The music inside the club pulsed like a heartbeat, loud and oppressive. The veteran slipped through the side entrance, bypassing the bouncers with ease. He moved through the dimly lit corridors, his focus unyielding. In a storage room near the back, he found what he was looking for, a stash of drugs and cash that fueled the cartel's operations. He worked quickly, rigging the room with makeshift explosives fashioned from household items. As he set the final charge, the door burst open, and 2 cartel guards stormed in. The veteran reacted instantly, taking them down with a combination of brutal efficiency and unrelenting force. One guard managed to fire a shot, the sound muffled by the music outside, but the veteran disarmed him before he could take another. With the guards neutralized, the veteran lit a fuse and slipped out the way he came. Moments later, the storage room erupted in flames, the explosion rocking the building. Panic spread through the nightclub as patrons scrambled for the exits, unaware of the war being waged in their midst. From a nearby rooftop, the veteran watched the chaos unfold. Smoke billowed into the night sky, and the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. He allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction before slipping away into the shadows once more. This was just the beginning. The cartel had declared war, and he intended to finish it on his terms. The following day, the cartel's response was swift and brutal. Santiago stood in the center of a warehouse filled with his top enforcers, the tension in the room palpable. The previous night's attack had not just wounded their operations, but had struck a blow to their reputation. Santiago's eyes burned with fury as he addressed the room, his voice sharp and unwavering. "Last night this man made fools of us," he began, holding up a tablet displaying the aftermath of the nightclub explosion. "He's not just some vagrant. He's a trained killer, and he's coming for us. If we don't stop him now, it's only a matter of time before he tears down everything we've built." One of the enforcers, a burly man with tattoos snaking up his neck, crossed his arms. "We've dealt with threats before, boss. What makes this guy so special?" Santiago's gaze sharpened. "What makes him special is that he's already outmaneuvered us. He's studied us, learned our weaknesses, and he doesn't fight like us. He fights to end it, quickly, decisively." He pointed to a map laid out on the table, red markers indicating their key locations across the city. "We're tightening security at all our assets. No more weak points. Double the guards at the distribution hubs, and no one moves without my say-so." As the enforcers dispersed to carry out his orders, Santiago lingered, his thoughts turning inward. He wasn't just angry, he was intrigued. This wasn't an ordinary adversary. This was someone with a purpose, someone who could challenge him in a way few had dared, and that made him dangerous. Meanwhile, the veteran had retreated to a safe house on the outskirts of the city. The room was sparse, but it served its purpose. A map of the city was pinned to the wall, marked with notes and potential targets. He sat at a small table, meticulously cleaning his rifle, every movement deliberate and focused. His mind was already on the next step. He knew the cartel would escalate, but he also knew their patterns, their reliance on intimidation and brute force. It was predictable, and predictability was a weakness he could exploit. His next move had to be bold, something that would force Santiago to overcommit and reveal more of his operation. Night fell, and the veteran moved under the cover of darkness. His target this time was a warehouse on the edge of the industrial district, a central hub for the cartel's smuggling operations. The building was heavily guarded, as he expected, but the veteran had no intention of walking through the front door. From a nearby rooftop, he surveyed the area, noting the positions of the guards and the patrol route. He spotted a weak point, a side entrance partially obscured by stacked shipping containers. Timing his movements with the patrols, he descended silently, slipping through the shadows like a wraith. The inside of the warehouse was a maze of crates and machinery, the air thick with the smell of oil and metal. The veteran moved quickly, planting small charges at structural weak points. He avoided direct confrontation, knowing that stealth was his greatest ally. But as he approached the main storage area, a voice cut through the silence. "You've got guts coming here, old man." The veteran froze, his hand hovering over the detonator. From the shadows, a figure emerged, the burly enforcer from earlier, flanked by two others. They blocked the exit, weapons drawn, but not yet aimed. "Santiago said you'd come," the enforcer continued, a smirk tugging at his lips. "He's been waiting for you to make your move. Thought you might want an audience for your last stand." The veteran's eyes darted to the crates behind the men. He'd already set charges there. All he needed was an opening. "You talk too much," he said calmly. The enforcer's smirk faltered, replaced by a scowl. Big words for a dead man. Before the enforcer could react, the veteran hurled a small device toward the group. It clattered to the ground, releasing a blinding flash of light and a deafening bang. Using the distraction, the veteran dove behind a stack of crates as gunfire erupted, bullets tearing through the air where he'd just stood. The veteran pressed the detonator. The charges he'd planted exploded in a series of deafening blasts, sending crates and debris flying. The shock wave knocked the enforcers off their feet, and the warehouse began to groan under the strain of collapsing supports. Amid the chaos, the veteran moved with precision, taking out the dazed enforcers one by one. The burly man managed to recover, swinging a crowbar wildly, but the veteran sidestepped the attack and delivered a swift blow that sent him crashing into a pile of rubble. As the dust settled, the veteran stood alone amidst the wreckage. The warehouse was in ruins, smoke and flames licking at the night sky. Sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer. He knew he had to move quickly. He slipped out through the side entrance, disappearing into the night before the authorities arrived. Another blow had been dealt, but he knew the war was far from over. Santiago would be furious, and the cartel would come at him with everything they had. But the veteran welcomed it. This was the only life he knew, and he'd see it through to the end. The cartel's next move came swiftly, as the veteran knew it would. By dawn, Santiago had mobilized his forces, setting up checkpoints throughout the city and ordering his men to track down their elusive adversary. It was no longer just about retaliation. It was about sending a message. Santiago couldn't allow a single man to disrupt his empire without consequences. The veteran's actions had lit a fire, and now the cartel was intent on burning everything in its path to extinguish it. From a hidden vantage point on a rooftop, the veteran watched as cartel vehicles patrolled the streets below. Black SUVs crawled through the neighborhoods, their occupants scanning every alley and doorway. Groups of armed men moved in tight formations, questioning locals and intimidating anyone who hesitated to answer. The city was on edge, its usual rhythm disrupted by fear and tension. The veteran adjusted the scope on his rifle, tracking one of the patrols. He had no intention of engaging them directly, not yet. For now his focus was on gathering intel, observing their movements, and identifying their weaknesses. He noted how the vehicles communicated, the timing of their routes, and the apparent hierarchy among the men. Every detail mattered. As he observed, his thoughts turned to Santiago. The man was methodical, intelligent, and dangerous. The veteran knew that Santiago would be anticipating his next move, setting traps and using his men as bait. But Santiago also had an ego, and ego was a weakness. The veteran could use that. By midday, the veteran had identified his next target, a communications hub disguised as a logistics office in the heart of the cartel's territory. The building was nondescript, blending in with the surrounding businesses, but the constant flow of cartel members in and out gave it away. If he could disrupt their communications, he could throw their operations into chaos, giving himself a tactical advantage. Under the cover of darkness, the veteran made his approach. The area was heavily guarded, with men stationed at every entrance and patrolling the perimeter. He moved silently, using the shadows and his knowledge of urban warfare to stay out of sight. A utility ladder on the side of a neighboring building provided access to the roof, where he found an air duct leading into the office below. Inside, the building was a hive of activity. Men barked orders into radios, while others worked on laptops, monitoring feeds from surveillance cameras positioned throughout the city. The veteran moved with calculated precision, avoiding detection as he planted small, powerful explosives. At key points around the room, he paused near a stack of documents, quickly scanning them for useful information. One file caught his eye, a detailed plan outlining the cartel's cartel's efforts to smuggle a large shipment of weapons into the city. He pocketed the file, knowing it could prove invaluable later. As he finished setting the charges, a guard entered the room, his eyes immediately narrowing at the sight of an unfamiliar figure. "Hey, who the hell are you?" the veteran reacted, instantly closing the distance between them before the guard could draw his weapon. A swift, silent takedown left the man unconscious on the floor, but the commotion had drawn attention. Voices called out from the hallway, and the sound of approaching. Footsteps grew louder. The veteran pressed the detonator. The explosives went off in a series of controlled blasts, destroying the communication equipment and plunging the building into darkness. Emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie red glow over the chaos. Shouts filled the air as Cartel members scrambled to understand what had happened. Using the confusion to his advantage, the veteran slipped out through the same air duct he had entered. He emerged onto the rooftop, the night air cool against his face. Below, the cartel's operations were in disarray. Vehicles sped toward the building, men shouting orders and pointing weapons into the shadows. The veteran watched for a moment, his expression unreadable, before disappearing into the night. By the time Santiago arrived at the scene, the damage had been done. The communications hub was a smoking ruin, and his men were shaken. He stood amidst the wreckage, his jaw clenched as he surveyed the scene. "Find him," he ordered, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't care what it takes. I want him brought to me, alive." But even as Santiago spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing into the veteran's hands. This wasn't just a war of strength. It was a game of strategy, and his opponent was several moves ahead. Santiago's frustration grew, but he forced himself to remain calm. He would find the veteran, and when he did, he would make sure the man understood what it meant to cross the cartel. The veteran, meanwhile, had already moved on. He sat in a dimly lit room, poring over the file he had taken from the communications hub. The shipment of weapons was scheduled to arrive in 3 days, and the location of the drop-off point was heavily guarded. It would be risky, but if he could intercept the shipment, it would cripple the cartel's ability to retaliate. He folded the file and leaned back, his mind already working through the details of the operation. The war was far from over, but he was ready for whatever came next. The clock was ticking, and the veteran knew he had to move quickly. The cartel's weapon shipment, scheduled to arrive in less than 72 hours, presented both a challenge and an opportunity. If he could intercept it, he would not only deny Santiago the firepower to escalate the conflict, but also deliver a crippling blow to their operations. But the location, a sprawling industrial complex near the docks, was a fortress. Surveillance, drones, armed guards, and layers of security made it clear the cartel wasn't taking any chances. The veteran spent the first day meticulously scouting the area. From a distance, he observed the guards' shifts, the delivery schedules, and the routes used by supply trucks. He mapped the cameras and noted the blind spots. Each detail became part of a larger picture, a puzzle he had to solve if he wanted any chance of success. By nightfall, he had a plan, a high-risk infiltration that relied on speed, precision, and a fair share of luck. As the second night fell, the veteran prepared. In a small, nondescript safe house, he laid out his gear, a tactical vest, night vision, goggles, and a compact but lethal array of weapons. He double-checked every piece of equipment, knowing there would be no room for error. His movements were calm, almost meditative, but his mind raced with calculations and contingencies. At precisely 2 a.m., he made his move. The docks were quiet, the hum of machinery and the occasional bark of a distant guard dog, the only sounds breaking the stillness. He approached from the water, using a small inflatable boat to navigate the narrow channels between cargo ships. The dark waves lapped softly against the hull as he neared the edge of the complex, slipping unseen beneath a dock piled high with rusted shipping containers. Pulling himself up onto the dock, he moved quickly, his footsteps silent against the worn wood. The air was thick with the scent of salt and oil. He reached the perimeter fence, cutting through it with a pair of bolt cutters before slipping inside. Staying low, he navigated the maze of containers and machinery, avoiding the guards who patrolled with flashlights and rifles. The shipment was stored in a central warehouse, its location confirmed by the intel he had gathered. The building loomed. Ahead, its corrugated metal walls reflecting the dim glow of floodlight. He spotted 2 guards at the entrance, their postures relaxed but their rifles within easy reach. The veteran drew a knife, moving like a shadow until he was behind the first guard. A swift, precise strike left the man unconscious. Before the second guard could react, he was subdued with equal efficiency. Inside, the warehouse was a cavernous space filled with crates marked with obscure shipping labels. The veteran moved with purpose, locating the section where the weapons were stored. He found what he was looking for: crates of assault rifles, ammunition, and explosives. The sight confirmed what he already knew: this shipment could outfit a small army. He worked quickly, planting charges at key structural points throughout the warehouse. The explosives were small but powerful enough to destroy the weapons and render the building unusable. As he finished setting the last charge, the sound of approaching footsteps made him freeze. A patrol, drawn by some subtle noise or a flicker of movement, was closing in. The veteran ducked behind a stack of crates, his heart rate steady despite the tension. He watched as 3 guards entered, their flashlights sweeping the room. One of them paused near the detonator he had placed, bending down to inspect it. The veteran knew he couldn't let them disarm it. With practiced precision, he emerged from the shadows, taking the first guard down with a silent takedown. The other 2 turned, their shouts cut short as he dispatched them with a combination of speed and brutality. The warehouse was secure again, but the clock was ticking. The detonator was armed and the charges were set. The veteran slipped out through a side exit, making his way toward the water. As he reached the edge of the dock, he pressed the button. The explosion shattered the silence, a series of deafening blasts that lit up the night sky. Flames roared as the warehouse collapsed, sending a plume of smoke billowing into the air. The shock wave rippled across the docks, knocking over crates and sending panicked guards scrambling. The veteran didn't stop to watch. He was already back in his boat, disappearing into the darkness as chaos erupted behind him. By the time Santiago arrived, the scene was one of utter devastation. The warehouse was a smoldering ruin, the shipment destroyed. His men stood around helplessly, their expressions a mix of fear and frustration. Santiago's jaw tightened as he surveyed the damage, his mind racing with fury. "Enough," he growled, his voice low but filled with menace. "No more games. I want every resource we have focused on finding him. No more hiding, no more running. We end this." But even as he spoke, Santiago couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt creeping into his thoughts. The veteran wasn't just fighting back, he was dismantling the cartel piece by piece, and Santiago was running out of options. The hunter had become the hunted, and Santiago knew the game was nearing its end. Back in his safe house, the veteran sat in the dim light, cleaning his gear and reviewing his note. He crossed out the warehouse on his map, marking it as another victory, but his expression remained grim. The war was far from over, and the stakes were rising. Santiago would come for him, and when he did, the veteran would be ready. This wasn't just survival. This was justice. Santiago's fury had reached its boiling point. The veteran's attacks were no longer mere disruptions. They were full-scale assaults on his empire, and they were working. Cartel operations had ground to a halt, shipments delayed, routes compromised, and his men demoralized. Santiago knew he couldn't let this continue. If he didn't stop the veteran now, the cartel's hold on the city would crumble. By the following evening, Santiago had put a new plan into motion. Using intelligence gathered from his network, he identified the safe house where the veteran had been seen operating. He wasn't going to send a small team this time. He was going to end it decisively. A convoy of SUVs packed with armed enforcers rolled out, their tires crunching on the asphalt as they sped through the city. Santiago rode in the lead vehicle, his eyes sharp and his mind racing with strategies. At the safe house, the veteran was already aware of what was coming. From the moment the convoy left its base, he had been tracking it, using a combination of hacked surveillance feeds and his own network of informants. He knew Santiago wouldn't stop until one of them was dead, and he was ready for the confrontation. The safe house was a trap, a carefully prepared battlefield. The veteran had fortified the building, setting up booby traps, escape routes, and defensive positions. He had planned for every contingency, knowing that the fight ahead would be his most dangerous yet. As the convoy approached, the veteran took his position on the second floor, his rifle trained on the street below. Through the scope, he watched as the SUVs came to a halt, their doors swinging open to reveal a small army of cartel enforcers. Santiago stepped out last, his polished shoes hitting the pavement with a measured confidence. He scanned the building, his expression unreadable. "Spread out," Santiago ordered, his voice calm but commanding. "I want this place surrounded. No one gets in or out without my say." The enforcers moved quickly, fanning out to encircle the building. Some carried automatic rifles, others shotguns, and a few had grenades strapped to their vests. They were prepared for a war, but the veteran had no intention of giving them one on their terms. The first explosion rocked the street as one of the enforcers triggered a tripwire. The blast sent debris flying and threw 2 men to the ground. Chaos erupted as the others scrambled for cover, their carefully coordinated assault already falling apart. From his vantage point, the veteran fired his rifle, taking out 2 enforcers before they could react. He moved to a second position, his steps silent and deliberate. The building's interior had been transformed into a labyrinth of choke point and kill zones, each designed to give him the upper hand. Santiago remained outside, his expression dark as he listened to the gunfire and explosions from within. He barked orders into his radio, directing his men to regroup and push forward, but every step they took was met with resistance. The veteran was relentless, using every tool at his disposal to outmaneuver and outfight them. Grenades detonated in stairwells, forcing the enforcers to retreat. Makeshift barricades slowed their advance, while strategically placed mirrors and lights created disorienting reflections that made it impossible to pinpoint the veteran's location. Every corner they turned seemed to lead to another ambush. The time Santiago's men reached the second floor, their numbers had been halved. The veteran waited in the shadows, his breathing steady and his focus unshakable. As the first enforcer stepped into the room, he struck, a precise shot dropping the man instantly. The others hesitated, their confidence wavering. Santiago, growing impatient, decided to take matters into his own hand. He entered the building, flanked by his most trusted enforcers. His eyes scanned the carnage, his jaw tightening as he realized just how thoroughly the veteran had prepared. But he wasn't deterred. This was his chance to end the fight and reclaim control. The veteran, watching Santiago's approach through a crack in the wall, felt a strange sense of calm. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the culmination of everything he had fought for. He adjusted his position, his hand steady as he readied himself for the final confrontation. Santiago stepped into the room, his pistol drawn. "I know you're here," he called out, his voice echoing through the silence. "You've caused enough damage. It's time to end this." The veteran didn't respond. He waited, his movements precise and deliberate as he circled behind Santiago's group. In a single fluid motion, he struck, taking out one of Santiago's enforcers before slipping back into the shadows. Gunfire erupted, the room filled with flashes of light and the deafening roar of bullets. Santiago fired wildly, his composure slipping as the veteran outmaneuvered him at every turn. One by one, Santiago's men fell until only he remained. The room fell silent, the smell of gunpowder hanging heavy in the air. Santiago stood alone, his pistol trembling in his hand. The veteran stepped into the light, his rifle trained on Santiago's chest. "It's over," the veteran said, his voice calm but firm. "Call off your men. Walk away while you still can." Santiago's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the pistol. "You think you've won? You think this changes anything?" "It changes everything," the veteran replied. "Your men are gone. Your operations are in ruins. This city doesn't belong to you anymore." For a moment, Santiago seemed to consider his options. Then, with a sudden burst of desperation, he raised his pistol. The veteran fired first, a single shot that sent Santiago crashing to the ground. He approached slowly, his rifle still trained on the fallen man. Santiago looked up at him, blood staining his shirt. "You don't understand," he gasped. "There's always someone else, someone worse." "Maybe," the veteran said, "but not here, not now." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Santiago to his fate. The building was quiet now, the battle over, but the veteran knew the fight for the city's soul was far from finished. There would always be another threat, another battle to fight, and he would be ready. The city was quiet, its streets eerily empty in the wake of the cartel's collapse. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter, unburdened by the weight of fear and oppression. The veteran stood on the rooftop of an abandoned building, gazing out over the skyline as dawn painted the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. He had won the battle, but he knew the war was far from over. As the first rays of sunlight crept across the city, the veteran turned, his attention to the notebook in his hand. It was filled with names, locations, and note, a meticulous record of the cartel's operation. Many of the names were crossed out, their influence and power dismantled in the veteran's calculated campaign. But a few names remained, underlined and circled, their significance greater than the rest. They were the remnants of the network, Santiago had warned about, the shadowy figures who would rise to fill the void left by his fall. The veteran closed the notebook and slipped it into his jacket. He had no intention of letting those names remain unchecked. He had seen firsthand what unchecked power could do, how it could corrupt and destroy. His mission wasn't over. It had only shifted, evolving into something more expansive, more dangerous. He wasn't just fighting for the city anymore. He was fighting for every place like it, every person who had been silenced or crushed under the weight of greed and violence. Down below, the city stirred to life. Vendors opened their stalls, the smell of fresh bread and coffee wafting through the air. Children played in the streets, their laughter a stark contrast to the gunfire and explosions that had once defined the area. The veteran watched them for a moment, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. This was why he fought, not for revenge, but for the chance to give people back their lives, their futures. His thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of his burner phone. He pulled it from his pocket, his expression hardening as he read the message, a single address, followed by 2 words, "They're waiting." The veteran slipped the phone back into his pocket and adjusted the strap of his bag. He moved with purpose, descending the fire escape and merging into the crowd below. The address was across town, in a part of the city he hadn't been to since the start of his campaign. It was a calculated risk, but one he was willing to take. If there were people waiting for him, it meant the fight was far from over. The address led him to an old warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. The building was weathered and nondescript, its windows boarded up and its exterior covered in faded graffiti. The veteran approached cautiously, his senses on high alert. He pushed open the heavy metal door, the creak of its hinges echoing through the empty space. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a series of overhead lights that cast long shadows across the concrete floor. A group of people stood in the center of the room, their faces partially obscured by the harsh lighting. They were a mix of ages and backgrounds, their appearances unremarkable, but their presence charged with a quiet intensity. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward. "We've been watching you," she said, her voice steady. "What you did to Santiago and his operation, that was impressive." The veteran didn't respond immediately, his gaze sweeping over the group. He could see the determination in their eyes, the same fire that had driven him to act. "Who are you?" he asked finally. The woman exchanged a glance with the others before answering. "We're people who believe in what you're doing, people who want to help." The veteran raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. "Help? How?" Another member of the group, a younger man with a laptop slung over his shoulder, spoke up. "We have resources, information, connections. You've been doing this alone, but you don't have to anymore." The veteran considered their words, his instincts warning him to tread carefully. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, not after everything he had been through. But he also knew the truth of their offer. The fight was growing, and he couldn't do it all on his own. "Why now?" he asked, his tone measured. "Why wait until Santiago was gone?" The woman's expression softened slightly. "Because we needed to know if you were for real, if you could finish what you started, and you did." The veteran nodded slowly, his mind working through the implications. He didn't fully trust them, but he couldn't ignore the opportunity they presented. "All right," he said finally, "let's see what you've got." The group exchanged relieved glances, the tension in the room easing. The woman stepped forward again, extending a hand. "Welcome to the fight," she said. The veteran hesitated for a moment before taking her hand. "Let's get to work," he replied. As the sun rose higher over the city, the veteran knew this was only the beginning. The fight had evolved, and so had he. With allies by his side and a new mission ahead, he was ready to take on whatever came next. The city might have found a fragile peace, but the battle for justice was far from over. Weeks had passed since the veteran joined forces with the group. They called themselves the Quiet Front, a loose network of ex-military personnel, hackers, and everyday people who had grown tired of the violence and corruption gripping their city. Together, they had begun dismantling what remained of the cartel's infrastructure, each mission striking a precise blow against the remnants of Santiago's network. Tonight, they were gathered in the dimly lit basement of a safe house, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of laptop screens and scattered desk lamps. Maps and photographs covered the walls, each one marked with notes and plans for their next target, a luxury high-rise in the city center. The building was a front for a new new player trying to claim the void left by Santiago, a man known only as El Tabano. The veteran stood at the head of the room, his presence commanding but calm. He gestured to the map pinned to the wall. This isn't just a headquarters, it's their fortress. If we take this down, we send a message. No one fills Santiago's shoes without consequence. The younger man with the laptop, whom the veteran now knew as Danny, nodded, typing rapidly. El Tabano is doubling security every week. Cameras, armed guards, biometric locks. He's paranoid, which makes him dangerous but predictable. The woman with sharp eyes, who had introduced herself as Grace, stepped forward. Predictable doesn't mean easy. He's got connections we don't fully understand yet. We can't underestimate him. The veteran's gaze swept over the group. That's why we're going in smart. No direct assault, no unnecessary risks. Danny, you'll disable the surveillance grid remotely. Grace, you and I will handle the YEHA entry. The rest of you, support roles only. Keep the escape route clear. The room fell into a tense silence as the plan sank in. Finally, Grace spoke. What's the timeline? The veteran glanced at his watch. We move tomorrow night. Get some rest. You'll need it. The following evening, the team was in position. The high-rise loomed above them, its reflective windows glowing in the city's lights. From an adjacent rooftop, Danny hunched over, his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. I'm in, Danny's voice crackled over the comms. Surveillance grid is offline. You've got 10 minutes before the backup system kicks in. Copy that, the veteran replied, his voice low and steady. He and Grace moved swiftly across the rooftop, descending to the building's service entrance. Grace picked the lock with practiced ease, and they slipped inside, their footsteps silent against the polished floors. The first hurdle came quickly, a pair of guards patrolling the hallway. The veteran signaled to Grace, and they split up, flanking the guards from opposite sides. In perfect synchronization, they struck, neutralizing the guards without a sound. The veteran dragged the unconscious men into a nearby storage room, while Grace scanned for the next checkpoint. We're clear, Grace whispered. Elevators ahead. They reached the elevator, where a biometric scanner blocked access to the upper floors. Grace pulled out a small device, attaching it to the scanner's panel. Danny's voice came through their earpieces. Give me 30 seconds, and there, you're good to go. The elevator doors slid open, and they stepped inside, the soft hum of the machinery the only sound. As they ascended, the veteran adjusted his gear, his mind focused on the mission ahead. The doors opened to a lavish penthouse floor, its opulence in stark contrast to the chaos and poverty outside. The veteran's sharp eyes took in every detail, the ornate furniture, the marble floors, the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air. But what caught his attention most was the man standing at the far end of the room, his back to them as he gazed out over the city skyline. El Tabano, the veteran said, his voice cutting through the silence. The man turned slowly, a cold smile spreading across his face. He was impeccably dressed, his tailored suit and gold watch gleaming under the soft light. I was wondering when you'd show up, El Tabano said, his voice smooth and confident. You've been making quite the mess, haven't you? Cleaning it up, the veteran replied, his tone even. It's over. Walk away or you'll end up like Santiago. El Tabano chuckled, shaking his head. You think you're the first to try and take me down? I've survived worse than you. He clapped his hands twice, and a hidden panel slid open, revealing a small army of armed men. The veteran and Grace exchanged a glance, their bodies tensing. Danny, the veteran said quietly into his comms, how fast can you trigger the fire suppression system? Give me a second, Danny replied, the sound of frantic typing filling their ears. El Tabano's men began to advance, their weapons raised. Whatever you're planning, El Tabano said, it won't be enough. The veteran's lips curled into a faint smirk. We'll see about that. Suddenly, the sprinklers activated, dousing the room in water and releasing a thick white mist. The armed men hesitated, their visibility reduced to almost nothing. The veteran and Grace moved quickly, using the confusion to their advantage. They struck with precision, disarming and incapacitating the guards one by one. Within minutes, the room was silent again. El Tabano stood alone, his confidence shattered as the veteran approached. This is your last chance, the veteran said. Walk away, disappear, or I'll make sure you can't come back. El Tabano's eyes darted to the door, but he knew there was no escape. He raised his hand slowly, a bitter scowl on his face. You'll regret this, he spat. The veteran didn't reply. He motioned for Grace, and together they escorted El Tabano out of the building. As they disappeared into the night, the veteran knew the fight was far from over, but tonight they had won another battle and sent a message no one could ignore. The aftermath of the mission against El Tabano rippled through the city like a shockwave. Word spread quickly. The new cartel leader had been removed before his grip could tighten. The message was clear. No one could step into Santiago's shoes without consequences. For the quiet front, it was a victory, but for the veteran, it felt like another step on an endless path. Days passed in a tense lull. The city seemed to breathe easier, its streets quieter than they'd been in years. Yet the veteran couldn't shake the feeling that something darker loomed just beyond the horizon. He spent his time in preparation, training the group in combat, tactics, and refining their network of intelligence. Grace, Danny, and the others had proven their dedication, but the veteran knew they needed to be sharper, faster, and more disciplined for what was coming. One evening, as the group gathered in their safe house, Danny burst into the room, a laptop clutched tightly in his hands. His face was pale, and his usually steady voice was tinged with urgency. "We've got a problem," he announced, placing the laptop on the table and spinning it to face the group. On the screen was a live feed from a heavily fortified compound on the outskirts of the city. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their weapons gleaming under the harsh floodlights. Trucks came and went, carrying crates that were unmistakably filled with weapons. Danny tapped the screen, highlighting a figure stepping out of one of the trucks. "That's Miguel Alvarez," Danny said. "Former lieutenant under Santiago. He's been in hiding since the cartel fell apart, but now he's back, and it looks like he's rebuilding. If those crates are what I think they are, we're looking at a full-scale rearmament." Grace leaned closer, her sharp eyes narrowing. "How did we miss this?" she asked, her voice low. Danny shook his head. "He's been careful, operating under the radar. This compound wasn't on any of our maps. I only found it because one of our sources flagged a shipment moving through the docks last night." The veteran studied the screen, his expression grim. "What's the timeline?" "The next major shipment is set to leave in 48 hours, Danny replied. "If we don't stop it, Alvarez will have enough firepower to retake the city, and then some." The room fell silent as the weight of the situation sank in. Finally, the veteran spoke, his voice calm but resolute. "We hit the compound tomorrow night. Danny, I need a full layout of the area. Entrances, exits, weak points. Grace, round up the gear and prep the team. We're not just hitting their supply line. We're taking Alvarez out of the picture for good." The night of the operation, the team moved with practiced efficiency. They approached the compound under the cover of darkness, their movements silent and deliberate. Danny had hacked into the compound security system, looping the camera feeds to buy them a few precious minutes of invisibility. Grace led the way, her sharp instincts guiding them through the shadows. The veteran signaled for the team to halt as they reached the outer fence. Using wire cutters, they created a small opening and slipped through one by one. Ahead of them, the compound's main warehouse loomed like a dark monolith, its interior glowing with activity. Guards were stationed at every entrance, their vigilance a testament to Alvarez's paranoia. "Danny, status," the veteran whispered into his comm. "You're clear to move," Danny replied. "I've disabled the alarms, but you've got a 5-minute window before their backup systems kick in." The veteran nodded and motioned for the team to split into 2 groups. Grace took half to secure the perimeter, while the veteran led the others toward the warehouse. They moved swiftly, taking down guards with silent precision as they advanced. Within minutes, they reached the main entrance. Inside, the warehouse was a hive of activity. Crates of weapons lined the walls, and a handful of workers loaded them onto trucks. At the center of it all stood Alvarez, barking orders to his men. He was taller and more imposing than the veteran had expected, his presence commanding and his voice carrying a hint of arrogance. "Remember," the veteran whispered to his team, "we take out the guards first, then Alvarez. No loose ends." The team moved into position, each member taking aim at a different target. The veteran signaled, and chaos erupted. Gunfire rang out as the guards fell one by one, their surprise giving the team the upper hand. Alvarez shouted for reinforcements, but the veteran was already closing in on him. The 2 men clashed in a brutal hand-to-hand fight, their movements a blur of strikes and counters. Alvarez was strong, but the veteran was faster, his years of training giving him the edge. With a final decisive blow, he sent Alvarez crashing to the ground, unconscious. Grace appeared at the veteran's side, her weapon trained on the remaining workers. "What's the call?" she asked. The veteran glanced at Alvarez, then at the crates of weapons. "We destroy everything," he said. "No second chances." As the team set charges throughout the warehouse, the veteran dragged Alvarez outside, securing him in the back of one of the trucks. When the charges detonated, the explosion lit up the night sky, the warehouse collapsing in a fiery inferno. The veteran stood silently, watching as the flames consumed what remained of Alvarez's operation. "What now?" Grace asked, her voice soft. The veteran turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Now, we make sure no one else takes his place." Veteran dropped silently behind him, a ghost in the darkness. In one swift motion, he disarmed the man, pulling him into a chokehold that rendered him unconscious in seconds. The second enforcer barely had time to react before the veteran closed the distance, delivering a precise strike to his temple that sent him crumpling to the ground. The broad-shouldered man heard the commotion and turned, his gun drawn. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted. The remaining enforcers fanned out, their weapons raised as they searched for the unseen threat. The veteran moved like a phantom, using the shadows and machinery to his advantage. He struck quickly and decisively, taking down each man before they could raise the alarm. Within minutes, the warehouse was eerily silent, the enforcers lying unconscious or incapacitated. The broad-shouldered man stood alone now, his confidence evaporating as he realized the extent of the carnage. He spun in circles, his gun shaking in his hand as he shouted into the void, "Come out! Face me, you coward!" From the shadows, the veteran's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You made a mistake coming after me." The man whirled around, his eyes wild. "Who are you? What do you want?" The veteran stepped into the light, his expression cold and unyielding. "I want you to leave these streets and never come back. Tell your boss this city isn't his playground anymore." The broad-shouldered man laughed nervously, trying to mask his fear. "You think you can scare us off? We're the cartel. We own this place." "Not anymore," the veteran replied. His voice was calm, but the weight of his words left no room for doubt. The man raised his gun, his hands trembling. "Stay back. I'll shoot." The veteran moved with lightning speed, closing the gap before the man could react. He twisted the gun from his grasp and delivered a sharp blow to his chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Standing over him, the veteran leaned in, his voice low and deadly. "Tell your boss he's next if he doesn't back off. And if I see you or your men again, I won't be so merciful." The broad-shouldered man nodded frantically, his bravado shattered. The veteran stepped back, his gaze lingering on the man for a moment before turning and walking away. The warehouse fell silent once more, save for the faint sound of the man's labored breathing. As the veteran disappeared into the night, he knew this was only the beginning. The cartel would regroup and the fight would escalate, but he was ready. This was his war now, and he would see it through to the end. The next morning broke with a pale, watery light filtering through the haze of the city. The veteran sat on a rooftop overlooking the waking streets, his posture still, but his mind racing. The previous night's events replayed in his head, every detail examined for weaknesses for what might come next. He knew the cartel would not let his actions go unanswered. They would retaliate, and this time they wouldn't underestimate him. Down below, the city moved on as if nothing had happened. Vendors opened their stalls, children hurried to school, and commuters shuffled along with their coffee cups and briefcases. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. The veteran could feel it, the subtle shift in the air that spoke of a storm gathering. In a sleek black SUV parked near the corner of a busy intersection, a man watched the streets with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. He was impeccably dressed, his tailored suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to the gritty surroundings. This was Santiago, one of the cartel's top lieutenants, a man known for his ruthlessness and cunning. He held a tablet in his hands, scrolling through surveillance footage from the warehouse. The broad-shouldered man from the night before sat in the passenger seat, his face pale and drawn. His hands fidgeted nervously in his lap as Santiago turned. To him, his expression unreadable. "This is the man who did this?" Santiago asked, his voice soft but carrying an unmistakable edge. The broad-shouldered man nodded. "Yes, boss. He's not just some homeless guy. The way he moved, it was like he's done this 100 times before." Santiago's eyes narrowed as he leaned back in his seat, considering this information. 100 times, you say? Interesting. And you thought it wise to confront him without proper preparation? The man swallowed hard, unable to meet Santiago's gaze. "We didn't know, boss. We thought he was just—" "You thought wrong," Santiago interrupted, his voice now icy. He turned back to the tablet, replaying the footage of the veteran, systematically dismantling the cartel enforcers. "This man is a problem, and problems must be eliminated." Santiago's fingers tapped on the tablet, bringing up a profile. It was sparse, but it confirmed his suspicions. A former Marine, highly decorated, with a service record that read like the plot of an action film.